So, Renato, can Trump unilaterally dismantle agencies that were created by statute?
Eh, it's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal and national security analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a skeet. Well, Asha, you were gone last week. Great to have you back. We actually had some great news last week. Good news, I would
I
say.
heard, and I'm glad that we were able to maybe have a little bit more of a positive story after weeks and weeks of frankly pretty depressing stuff.
Yes, and I think it's fair to say that our first story here today that we're talking about is also positive, sort of. I'd say so. I'd say the latest news is positive because we're going to be talking about the lawsuit that was brought to try to halt Trump's attempt to dismantle Voice of America and essentially broadcasts that were created by Congress uh, to have, I would say, free speech and journalism overseas and create an outlet for journalism. I believe this was during the Cold War, right?
It was actually Voice of America was created, I believe, in 1942 during World War II in order to provide accurate reporting about the war to Germans in German. So it's basically been a counter propaganda tool. So when other countries try to, you know, engage in propaganda, manipulate their own citizens, have closed societies, this definitely continued into the Cold War. So it was disseminating news to the Soviet Union in Russian and, even in past decades into China and Chinese. So in their native language to provide real, unbiased, objective, factual news as a way to counter propaganda. And, I think it's really important in this age of disinformation, Renato, because, I teach my class on disinformation and democracy. And one of the things we talk about is how disinformation is an asymmetrical threat when it's being used by foreign states because they can do it to us, right? Like they can create face accounts on Facebook and push all this stuff out because we have an open society, but we have limited ways of turning it around and doing it back to them because they have closed societies and they have much more control over the press. And that's why entities like Voice of America are one of sort of the few uh, tools that we have that are consistent with our own values that we can use to counter other nations in this space.
Yeah, I just think that this is probably not consistent with Donald Trump's values.
No,
Perhaps.
factual, objective, and clear cut news is really not his cup of tea.
Exactly, and I think that may have had something to do with this, right, Asha? If I recall correctly, this is really Trump reacting to a Voice of America journalist who asked him a tough question, right?
Well, his animosity goes back a little bit farther. He's been mad at Voice of America for a while, partly, I think, because Voice of America refused to sign on with his narrative that China created the COVID-19 virus. And so I think at the time, I don't know what they were reporting, that it was not clear what the origins were or whatever, but this made him mad. So he's had this in the background, and I think, he has not been a fan of this for a while. And I think in the first administration, he also put somebody in charge of Voice of America's parent company, who tried to make some changes, less drastic, didn't really get on our radar. But yeah, the move that he made with his executive order in this term came 2 days after he was asked a question during a press conference, I think, about whether he planned to expel people from Gaza and build hotel strip or something like that, and it made him mad, and he asked, "Where are you from? Who are you with?" And the reporter said, "I'm with Voice of America." And he was like, "Yeah, obviously, I only Voice of America would have asked that question or something." And then 2 days later, there's this executive order that comes out targeting Voice of America.
Well, and he had, I think, had plans to try to subvert Voice of America because I believe he's in Carrie Lake over there. She is actually one of the defendants in the lawsuit that we're going to be talking about today. Carrie Lake, of course, being a woman who ran for, I believe, was it governor before she ran for senator? Or was it senator before she ran for governor? I
I can't
forget.
even keep track. She's
Or
an
was it?
election denier,
Yeah.
also not a fan of truth.
Yes, I think that's fair to say. She's almost like eerily more like propaganda-esque than Trump, or is it? Wouldn't you say she's even more down that road, which is really something? It's
Yeah.
out Trump.
Yes.
Yes. So this is a lawsuit essentially about Trump's attempt to essentially dismantle the entire organization, basically telling, Trump essentially basically ordered the staff don't show up for work. Basically, essentially tried to shutter the agency by himself. And by the way, I just want to say, because the stakes here are significant, this is not the only agency that Trump is trying to shut down. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau comes to mind as another agency where he's basically just tried to fire everybody, try to shut them down as much as possible, even though a statute created that agency as well. But here, unlike the CFPB, you could argue, well, that's maybe a policy disagreement he has. I think here, what's interesting is you really, in addition to the argument that maybe the CFPB would have, there's also a really strong First Amendment argument here, because really what he's reacting to is the Voice of America doing what journalists do, which is asking questions and reporting about what's happening, right? And that's a protected First Amendment speech.
Yeah. So, in addition to basically telling people to furlough its employees, and I think they fired 500 VOA contractors, they turned off the radio transmitters and shut down the computer servers. So, the First Amendment argument here is just sort of a very classic prior restraint argument that
Right.
they're shutting down journalism that basically prevents content from coming out before it's even created. And so the journalists are deprived of their ability to basically report the news. I mean, it's you can see obviously the First Amendment implications. I think the First Amendment argument has some limitations, though, right? Because it doesn't get to the existence of Voice of America itself. In other words,
Right.
journalists obviously have a First Amendment right. They don't have a right to, do work for a government funded agency. So even if you were to acknowledge that their First Amendment rights were infringed upon, if Trump actually has the ability to dismantle the agency itself, the First Amendment argument doesn't reach that particular action, I don't think.
And
Or
right.
it's much more tenuous, I think.
Yeah, well, it's also means, because I think what we try to do on this podcast is talk about things that have a broader implication. Here, I think the reason that they're making the argument is they're saying, well, if you shut down the agency for good reasons, like, okay, we have cost issues or whatever, that's one thing. But to shut it down in response to speech is a different thing, right? That's viewpoint discrimination. But putting that to the side here, I think let's talk about the broader issue, because I think it's interesting. And that is that Trump is essentially taking all these actions to shutter an agency that's part of the executive branch, but just created by statute. And it's interesting. The reason I use the CFPB, that's a very substantial agency created during the Obama administration. It's the National Consumer Protection Function. They also have, I think, 95% of their employees have been terminated, and they're basically, I mean, they're effectively operating in on a shoestring at this point. And there's been the same sort of conversation about that agency. And here they're essentially making a non-First Amendment argument as well. And the way that the argument was teed up in this lawsuit that we're discussing, which is a lawsuit that was brought by journalists at Voice of America and by the Union of Government Employees as well, it was essentially that the decision to shutter this agency and take these drastic actions was done in violation of the Administrative Procedure Act because it's arbitrary capricious. There's no actual reason. It's contrary to law. Obviously, there's a statute that created the Voice of America and mandated that it would function, but it's also, and obviously in this case, unconstitutional as well.
Yeah, and even more broadly, this is basically a separation of powers argument, right? That Congress has created this, it's appropriated money for this to be funded and to continue having it funded unless, certain conditions are met and articulated, by the way, as you noted, under the Administrative Procedures Act. And so, and I think this kind of gets to how he's operating in other contexts. And I don't know if it's more or less persuasive with this particular agency, but it's getting to, if Trump can basically dismantle it, then he's usurping the fundamental legislative function of Congress and its power of the purse. And I think it's just important that this is kind of where we are right now with this administration. The fundamental separation of powers here, the checks on the president from Congress is its power of the purse, right? And its ability to pass laws. And with courts, its ability to say what the law is and to ensure compliance. And I think it's just important to note that on both of these fronts, what Trump is trying to do is usurp those particular, to undermine and then usurp those checks into the executive branch itself.
Yeah, we've talked about this previously in this podcast where Trump is basically, there's money that's appropriated by Congress to be spent on something, and then Trump essentially saying, well, I'm going to try to halt the ability of halt the expenditure of money that's been appropriated by Congress. So Congress is like, we're going to build this road, let's just say hypothetically, and Trump's like, no, I'm going to hold on to that money and not spend it, not do what Congress passed the law to do and was signed into law by the president. Here, there's not just one law, by the way, as the lawsuit makes clear, there's all these different acts that get passed over time that do all sorts of, things that mandate all sorts of different things in relation to this agency. And Trump would effectively be overturning those laws if he, through an executive order, was able to say, well, we're going to just not have, like you said, we're going to just pull your computers and don't report to work, please, and so on and so forth.
Right. And so the Administrative Procedure Act requires an agency to give reasons for when it makes policy changes. And people will be shocked to know that the Trump administration did not provide any reasons, or I think it provided one sentence. I think basically, saying something like this is radical news organization or something. So, there's no data, there's no explanation. And so it meets that arbitrary, capricious, abuse of discretion, not in accordance with law standard by the APA.
So the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act that Asha just mentioned, kind of cornerstone of American administrative law. And it's important because when the framers of our Constitution, the creators of our Constitution, created the separation of powers you mentioned before in the constitutional structure, they didn't contemplate like agencies in the way that we have them now, like all these different agencies, 3-letter agencies doing all sorts of things. And I think it's important that when agencies are taking action, or in this case, inaction, or however you want to look at it, that they provide reasons, that those can be brought to court and challenged in court and so on. And that's really, in many ways, I think it hooks into Asha, something that a broader constitutional protection we talked about in a prior episode of due process. This way, if the government's doing things, whether it's spending money or in this case, maybe doing the opposite of that, there's reasons provided so that this way you can determine whether or not there's, for example, of whether there's an equal protection under the laws, whether it's done for a proper reason, but also so that you can go to court. And if, for example, you've been deprived of your property, or in this case, like a job or something along those lines, you can challenge that if the reasons are invalid.
Yeah. I just want to highlight here, and I don't know if there's a direct link to the case that we discussed last year that went the Supreme Court decision about, this was the fisheries and wildlife case where the Supreme Court basically said, it narrowed the ability for agencies to exercise discretion, to interpret rules or regulations within those agencies. And I just think it's interesting that that was a conservative pet project, right? To limit agency discretion because of how much, the impact that it has in all of these other regulatory areas. And then here you are with Trump, who's basically, I wouldn't even call this discretion. It's just sort of doing whatever he wants. You know what I mean? Like, it's just interesting that was the conservative agenda, was to limit executive branch discretion in these agencies. And, I mean, and here's an example of it just going in the complete opposite direction.
So many ironies, Ash. I mean,
so many.
Yeah. I mean, when I was in law school, as an intern for a Democratic senator, the big thing was all free trade. We were hearing from the Republicans. I mean, the idea that you would have a tariff to try to protect manufacturing jobs in the United States was seen as such a radical left idea. So there's all sorts of ironies here in the Trump era, but this case is interesting because, just to circle back here, we talked about potential, I would say, with good news. The judge here, Judge Lamberth, who was I believe a Reagan appointee, essentially issued an injunction saying, okay, government cannot shut down this agency. You have to keep this agency functioning. And the idea there's irreparable harm. If these people all lose their jobs and they aren't, the broadcasts are stopping and so on, you can't like recreate this later. Everyone has got to eat, so they're going to ultimately find jobs elsewhere, and you won't be able to kind of put Humpty Dumpty back together again, which makes a lot of sense. It ultimately that was overturned or stayed, excuse me, by the Court of Appeals, a 2-1 decision in the DC Circuit
with
Court
two
of
Trump
Appeals.
appointees, I believe.
That's right. And then there was an en banc hearing of the full Court of Appeals, which is essentially all the judges on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals coming together to review what that panel, that randomly chosen panel of 3, had decided. And by a 7-4 vote, they have reinstated that injunction. So for now, the Voice of America journalists, I believe there's 1,300 journalists and employees, according to the complaint, still have their jobs and don't have to be looking for work and so forth.
And the en banc order came pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, it did, which I think what a lot of times what happens is when the judge who's in the minority in the 2-1 decision in the panel, often when they they can often get that going, right? So they're often
That's
talking to the other judges. At least when I clerked in the Court of Appeals, there was like a lot of discussion amongst the judges at certain points.
Yeah, and because it seems like the irreparable harm here, as you noted, is very urgent, right? So you would need to consider it. Not only the potential infringement on a First Amendment right, but as you noted, the inability to fix it if you waited too long.
Yeah, journalists now in the United States, we really have to treasure them. I think they're doing a public service.
Yeah.
Most journalists are living paycheck to paycheck. They're just trying to make ends meet and pay their bills. And if you're a journalist working for Voice of America and you don't have a job, well, you've got to figure out a way to pay the rent, pay your mortgage, and so on. So there was 1,300 people here who really were needed to know whether they were going to have a job.
Yeah. And not only these are journalists that are acting on behalf of our own foreign policy interests, right? I mean, we're countering foreign propaganda.
Well, as long as that is your interest and your agenda, yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah. But I agree. I agree with you. So, but my point is, but obviously there's a very significant, I mean, from a perspective of the lawsuit, right? The reason these people have standing is because their jobs are at
Yeah.
risk, understandably. And I think in this case, this is not a bunch of millionaires who are deciding, how much they dip into their savings. These are people who are relying on these jobs, and
Yeah.
not just journalists, but like people who are operating those servers and does that doing whatever, making sure the broadcasts are going through and so on.
So then this will be heard on the merits
Yep.
eventually, and I don't know if this is the kind of case that Trump could leap. I mean, I guess they're probably going to try to. They always go up to Supreme Court to try to get another stay.
They can try. I mean, we'll see what happens. I mean, the Supreme Court has at times shown that it will disagree with Trump, obviously. And we talked about that in the context of due process in a prior episode. One would think that there would be some Supreme Court justices who would be concerned about the administration in an arbitrary way violating the First Amendment, and also, trying to undo a statutorily created agency. But I guess we'll have to see what happens.
We will have to wait and see.
So, Asha, this was also a very big week for crypto.
This is your week, man.
This is my week. So, crypto week. So, a couple things happened this week.
Okay.
And I'll just lay it out for everybody. Okay,
I'm going to be Joe on the street in this segment.
Okay, fair enough.
Because you're pro crypto.
And
I'm skeptical citizen.
You're a crypto skeptic. Well, I'm pro crypto regulation. That's the way I look at it. So there's a couple bills in Congress. One is a bipartisan stablecoin act. Stablecoins are crypto that are essentially tied by
real money.
Real money. So they'll be exactly. So like you have something called, like, for example, USDC is a currency that's backed 1-to-1. It's a crypto coin that's backed 1-to-1 with a dollar. So what the Stablecoin Act is essentially says it regulates making sure you have proper reserves. So they either have to be like cash or short-term treasuries. Where the cash has to be, how it's regulated. Is it regulated by the feds or the state? And that depends on sort of how much reserves you have and so on.
Can I pause you?
Mm-hmm.
So stablecoin, like, who can issue stablecoin? Like, if I promised that I was going to back up an Asha stablecoin with actual money, can I just open up an exchange? Or is this something that banks issue? Or is this something that the government issues? I'm just confused.
It's not government. It's not the government. Generally, you have to have an entity. You have to have an entity that can be a custodian for the not only for the reserves, but then also for the coins itself. And so,
but the coins don't exist.
Well, they do exist.
I mean, they're digital. Not, so can I just open a bank account? In other words, I open a bank account. I put $1 million there. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I have the reserves. How do I create the stablecoin?
Well, you would actually have to create a blockchain and issue. I don't want to get too technical. Okay. Create a blockchain. You have to issue coins. But the point being is, this is essentially there are stable coins out there. This is regulating, ensuring that you're having federal and state regulation.
So I'm asking this because of the things that I'm skeptical about. Stablecoins seem the least skeptical,
right?
To me, because they seem like they're actually real money. I'm just wondering, like, how, like, what's the mint that creates them, and what would be the incentive to do it if you're basically it's effectively the same. In other words,
what's the incentive? Like, why would people want to use stablecoins? So there's a couple of reasons. First of all, by the way, I mean, I think that this bill it's actually the banks that, like Bank of America and so forth, that are behind this bill, because they want to be able to issue them. Mm-hmm. And for them, I think the value is that they don't have to deal with things like chargebacks and stuff like that, like you would have in credit cards. You're just going to have because people like digital transfers. but they don't like to be tied to having like the payment card
I see. So they
system.
don't have to go through the current payment providers.
Right.
They're cutting out those middlemen.
Right.
So I'm assuming credit card
It's an
companies don't
alternative.
they don't love this.
I don't know, but probably not. I don't know.
I'm just asking questions.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to speculate, but the bottom line is the banks are definitely interested in this. They want to be part of it. They're pushing this through. This is not super controversial. I say bipartisan, but Democrats and some Republicans, a couple of Republicans, put a whole voted against cloture to have more consumer protection added to the bill. So that happened this week in Stablecoins.
Right. This sounds reasonable.
All very reasonable. Then there is also this week introduced for the first time discussion draft from the House Financial Services Committee and Agriculture Committee of regulatory framework for cryptocurrencies writ large.
Okay.
And put not stable coins, which are kind of a separate thing, but basically saying that there's going to be digital commodities, which are going to be a lot. I would say most of crypto is going to be a digital commodity regulated by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission.
Not the Securities and Exchange.
Correct, not the SEC. Then I think
they basically made a decision on this very fundamental question that had not totally been answered yet. Which is whether crypto is a security or a commodity.
Correct. Now, they say in there that except for ones that are security, but it's pretty obvious from reading the bill that they expect them all to be basically commodities. They make note, though, that your initial sale of crypto, so if you create Asha coin, your initial sales will be, the investment contract will be security. So it's like if you have an orange grove, the oranges will be commodities, but your payments or your issuance of securities to sell the orange grove will be securities. So your initial things will be securities. You're in the short run, you are going to be regulated. A lot of things will be regulated by the SEC because in this hypothetical Asha coin, because what it says in the bill is essentially things like sales by insiders and things like that are all going to have to be reported to the SEC. But then you'll, at a certain point, if you have what's called under the statute, a mature blockchain system where it's very decentralized and not a lot of people own anything, then it'll be there'll be lesser SEC reporting requirements. It'll be more of a CFTC thing. And there'll be joint rulemaking, the SEC and CFTC, to sort of define all these things.
Okay, so explain to me, like I'm 5, how this applies to, say, Trump coin.
It doesn't, because meme coins are basically been declared by the SEC to be like collectibles, like Beanie Babies. And yes, that's a whole separate thing.
like Beanie Babies and Garbage Pail Kids.
Pretty much. Okay. So that's that I suspect, this would be my prediction on that. That because the SEC made that determination kind of before all this legislation, that's going to end up becoming like a state AG thing, where all the state AGs start rolling up these lawsuits on meme coin. That's just my prediction.
Just as kind of a consumer protection type of thing?
Consumer protection thing. Yep. It's just like people selling whatever stuff. And
so basically all these foreign governments buying Trump coin to get access, or even people just buying access. It's like they're buying Beanie Babies to go hang out with him.
Or buying suites in the Trump hotel or something. Mm-hmm. Just totally.
So it's just complete pay to play.
It's just. I would say they'll view it the way from the SEC's perspective. These are just not like financial instruments at all. They're just like whatever.
No, I understand that. I'm just trying to fully explain that there's like literally no, it's very directly pay to play.
I'm not going to comment on that. All I'm going to say is it is its own thing. So, but let's put it this way, not heavily regulated. It'll end up being regulated by the state level. I guess from my perspective, what I thought was interesting about this week is you're starting to see laws getting passed. You're starting to see kind of where things. I personally think this stuff's a good thing because I think more regulation is good for everybody. Because then this way you know what the rules are, and people have to start playing by the rules, and then these agencies can be looking out for people. And then if people aren't following the rules, it's easier to hold them accountable.
I don't disagree with that. I do think that there was a vacuum, and that's what allowed things like FTX and stuff like that to happen. So, I mean, using that example, how would this fill gaps that would, in other words, how would anything that you've described have made what Sam Bankman-Fried did harder, or would it?
Well, I think what would have happened is just if you have entities that are registered with an agency, they're audited on a regular basis,
Right.
and like they have to file reports and they have to self-certify and offerings and things like that. So it makes it harder for them to do things that are shady. Obviously, with FTX, there was fraud there, and you could still commit fraud, and obviously then the agencies can go after you if you commit fraud. But the idea is when we have regulated entities, it's easier to detect fraud, and it's more likely that consumers will be made whole, right? Customers will be made whole.
Yeah. So there would have been just much more transparency in terms of how he was operating.
Yeah, and I will just note that, I mean, I think from the perspective of federal regulators, they would say that the U.S. regulated entity is part of FTX because there was an international, and the U.S. customers were in relatively good shape. It was the international customers that weren't. And so making the U.S. an attractive place for these companies to be regulated is good. And I think having the financial world regulated by the United States is, I think, good for the United States, but it's also it's better than the alternative, which is them being regulated by Bermuda or something.
Now, what about the cryptocurrency stockpile?
No, that is still an amorphous concept, I think, at this point. There's been, I would say, contradictory statements about that. But as of right now, what we understand is that it's supposedly going to be created via asset forfeiture over time. But that's sort of its own thing. Like that's sort of its own executive action.
Okay.
Questionable.
So basically all the shady stuff is not really regulated by anything that you just described.
Well, what I would say is, as we've learned, the executive branch can do a lot of things without direct court oversight or supervision of that, particularly official acts. So, but everybody else has to make sure that they get language that's favorable to them in the latest draft bill that Congress is considering.
I guess something is better than nothing.
There you go.
So, Renato, before we go, the new Pope is from Chicago.
Yeah, it's freaking awesome. Okay, first of all, everybody in Chicago is so excited. I got all these texts from people like, do you know the Pope? Do you know the Pope? Do you know the Pope? I don't, by the way. I did know Cardinal George, who was his mentor.
Would there be a reason? I mean, is Chicago so tight that you might have known him?
Yeah, I mean, if you get, what I would say is, like, for example, I've met Cardinal George many times, who was sort of his mentor. And so if Cardinal George had become the Pope, that would have been like cool, right? I had been like hanging out with the Pope, been on a panel with the Pope,
I love that. Okay.
Okay, but I didn't know him, although I've seen photos of him at the Sox game. Like, that was so cool. I mean, he was at the World Series at Comiskey watching the Sox win the World Series in 2005. That's so cool. I'm a Sox fan. So for me, that was like, wow, the Pope's a Sox fan. That's awesome.
Yeah. So what else? What else are you excited about?
Well, I mean, he literally, he's from Chicago. He grew up in the suburbs. He went to Chicago schools. He's a Bulls fan and a White Sox fan, as am I.
He better be careful wearing that Bulls hoodie or gear because, by the way, I believe he has to renounce his U.S. citizenship because he is a foreign head of state now.
Wow. That's crazy, by the way.
Which means if he's loitering outside a Home Depot wearing Chicago Bulls gear, he could get detained by ICE.
Uh,
for being a member of MS-13 because that is a sign.
yeah, well, speaking of that, he also has an account on Twitter/X, whatever you want to call X, in which he was somewhat critical, I would say, of Trump and Vance, which was fascinating to see as well.
It is fascinating to see. He does it really nice. I mean, it's not really trolling, but it's sort of papal trolling of Vance. And it's I am just waiting. What do you think the timeline is before JD tries to get in an argument with the Pope on Twitter?
Well, there was some talk because I don't know if you saw Vance's first tweet where he's like, basically hooray for the Pope or whatever. It was very carefully worded to not say he was praying for the Pope, according to certain observers, that it was like
Oh.
it was not, he did not say what you usually say, apparently.
What do you usually say?
I guess you're supposed to say we pray for the
We
Pope.
pray for the Pope.
But yeah,
Okay.
and so he did not say that.
I'll pray for the Pope.
There you go. Well, one thing I'm happy about from my perspective, I mean, aside from the fact that like we have a Chicagoan who, by the way, like, his brother has been all over Chicago news. Like, so as a Chicagoan, like his
What does his
brother,
brother do?
his brother likes like, hey, my brother, he's just talking about what his brother's like and stuff. So it's like to Chicago, it's just like super interesting because we think we're great, and we like, it's like one of us is there.
Yeah.
So he's like, by the way, he was playing like Words with Friends and Wordle with his brother like just 2 weeks ago or a week ago when they were going into the conclave or whatever. And it was super interesting. It was just like he's just like trying to get his brothers, and his brother watched was it the Netflix show about the Conclave movie or whatever?
Yeah, I haven't seen that.
Well, the Pope has. He said
hilarious.
he watched it with his brother. I don't know. I thought it was pretty cool.
The Pope does Netflix and chill.
I thought that was awesome.
I love that. But yeah, back to JD though. Is he going to get what was he didn't say he was praying.
Yeah.
And I saw the one tweet that the now Pope, before he was Pope, said about, because this was in response to JD saying something like, Christianity doesn't require you to love other people more than you love your own family.
Yeah, it's not what Jesus said. Right?
Yeah, and he was like, yeah, that's not exactly what Jesus doesn't make you rank the people you love.
Yeah, that was awesome. And I think one thing that's great is like Pope Francis was, I would say, a revolutionary pope in a certain sense in terms of his love for ordinary people and his desire to be Christ-like towards people who were disadvantaged and were struggling and so on. And I mean, there's so many amazing images, right, of Pope Francis with people who were sick or people who were disabled, people who were disfigured and so on. And this Pope, Pope Leo really seems to be a cut from the same cloth.
Yeah. 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 I used to refer to Pope Francis as cool Pope.
Well, now
I think there might be cooler Pope.
We'll see. I mean, isn't
not
it
to
amazing?
Rank my popes, but
just saying. The first American Pope being like a Chicagoan who's not into Trump. I think that's great. I couldn't be happier.
I think I'm excited. I think this is a good development in the spiritual world and hopefully a harbinger of maybe where we are headed in the long arc of the moral universe.
Now he just needs to pray for the White Sox.